Thanks everybody for joining. Hope you guys had a good lunch. They gave me the pre-lunch spot. They gave me the post-lunch spot. So clearly they knew that I could lead people into lunch. Now can I keep people awake? This is the real test here. So we've got a really good panel. We've got folks from all over the world here talking about how we can use data, how we can prevent injuries, how we can optimize performance. And I think the exciting thing is when you have this many different perspectives, the first thing to do is take stock in the fact that the games are changing, athletes are changing. The last panel with the nutrition group, we talked about what's changing with the athlete. I want to start with this group, and we'll work our way back here with what's changing in your game that's impacting performance and health. So we'll start at the end here.
Faster, higher, longer. It's a greater physical demand exposed to players these days. So I would say that's a big thing. And then volume, sheer volume from a young age. And that volume is usually not so variable. It's within one sport or one domain.
So we're seeing specialization, and we're seeing heavy specialization, and that's impacting stuff. That's a great transition, and I want to give everybody a chance to talk about their respective areas, but that's really helpful because I think our next panelist sees it from HSS. Andy, and then we'll come to you, Alex. Andy, you've seen this at the NBA level, you've seen this at the PT level in hockey and other sports. What are you seeing? And then Alex, I'm really curious how you're going to approach it from your population at the youth athlete level and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think to echo that, they're getting more demands in terms of the physiological outcomes, but then also the psychological too. I think the stresses that they're exposed to from external influences, the media, the social media, the access that people have now, is another layer of cognitive stress that affects overall well-being.
So you can't get a great PT workout from Instagram?
I mean, there's a lot of misinformation. Depends on the PT.
Yep.
But yeah, there's lots of factors now that are really influencing the overall well-being of athletes and how they can optimize their performance, especially at the highest level. And then the demands of the game have changed a lot over the last 10, 15 years. Seeing more intense actions, more explosive actions, and players are getting stronger, but not necessarily more robust because of maybe it's not strength that's the problem.
Alex?
So I think I sort of see it, as you mentioned, from the youth level all the way to the pro level. And one of the biggest things I see is there's more demand for information. And at the pro sport level, the demand is coming now from the team to folks like us that are independent of the team and maybe only working with them for a short amount of time. So they want to see the data the way that they process it as well. And that's forced us to reevaluate how we establish norms and how we evaluate our high-level players. And then on the flip side of that, you see similar demands from U14 parents or club coaches that are looking to get as many of their players into colleges. And so because of that feeder system, the information that they're looking at is not based off of any kind of large amount of library of data that they have. It's just off of whether it's Instagram or whether it's something that someone else told them is important, or because another club or another organization is looking at it. And so we're having to, sometimes it's misinformation, sometimes unfortunately it's just enough information you can't completely throw it out the window, and you're forced to re-educate someone over and over again like it's Groundhog Day, because I think the demand for information and for metrics is only going up. There are very few teams and organizations that actually know what they want to see and why they want to see it. And I think that bubble becomes more and more diluted as you get lower and lower in the ranks, certainly at development levels.
I'm going to throw here one stat out here before we go to Joel. This is the I want it and I want it now generation, right? For everybody, whether you're a pro athlete or a youth athlete. 15% of college football players transferred schools last year and entered the transfer portal. Next year's probably going to be 30%. Think about that. That means that you're not getting playing time somewhere and you're going to go somewhere else and you think you're going to get playing time. That's the world we live in. And they want it, and they want it now. Joel, how are you seeing that manifest at the athlete level, and then how do you manage it at the team level? Because you're faced with this inundation of information. What's changing for you?
Well, so I work. Is it on? Can you hear me? There we go. Hi. So I work in women's sports. I work with professional teams with women as the athletes. So for me, what's changing? Everything, really. Especially right now, women's sports are just so much at the forefront of news, media, access. Everything's kind of changing. So I think your other question was like, how do I help manage that? I think it's really just trying to sift through all that information, and kind of what all of them have said is the same thing, but it's almost on hyperdrive, kind of for the women's sports side. So making sure, or trying to help people understand all the data that they have at their fingertips, all the information at their fingertips, and trying to be a reliable resource for them to help sift through all that. But yeah, everything's kind of changing right now for us.
And it's changing fast. Garrett and Gordon, how is it changing in the tech side for you guys?
Well, hello, there we go. This theme of wanting instant gratification is, I think, true for us, and that's a big part of why people are drawn to our product and services, because that helps athletes recover faster, get back on the ice, get back on the court, get back on the field faster. So that plays well. In terms of the drive for more data and more information, I think that that's a great thing, and I love all of the quantifying all these different, the like Kinvent that Alex is doing, and all these other things that show these clearer before and after changes, because that's something that has helped us, showing the objective changes in our product. So I love seeing the movement of all of these objective measurements, just picking up off of this theme here, because that shows what's working really. I mean, a lot of times people do things because they've always done it that way. We're talking about rehabilitation and performance, and don't necessarily quantify whether what they're doing is really working. So I like that we're moving in a direction where we realize that if we're going to spend our time and energy doing something, that it's important that we get a return on that time and effort. And this data allows us to do that. And then one other comment when we talk about early specialization and talk about these other stressors, one of the biggest themes that really jumps out at me is this environmental mismatch and the epidemic of non-contact injuries and things that we can do movement and training wise, but also things that we can do like optimizing circadian biology, things that we can do, and I know there's wonderful panelists on the nutrition side, but all these other things, I think taking a more holistic view on that can really help with that injury prevention also.
Thanks, Robbie. Just to very quickly sort of give my background as well, I'm coming from Australia, and we have a very broad range of sports that we're involved with through the Olympic programs and so on. And I think as well as professional sports in that environment, I think all of the things that have been said by the panel, I agree with. You've got to be able to provide a very short, sharp, cutting through piece of information that's relevant to those individuals that you're dealing with at the time, and they can be very different audiences all in the same organisation. The attention span is, I know it's a cliche, but the attention span in some of these spaces is really, really short. So building on that, I think the listening is really important for us as well. We're talking about how we develop the technology and how we build in this space. Understanding what it is people want. Sometimes do we know what they want, but do they know what they want? Is a real challenge.
Yeah, so we'll, again, work our way back. Well, do you think that technology is allowing you to personalize care? And if so, how do you take that data and make it relevant to a personal rehab scenario for an athlete?
That's a good question. I think it can aid you. The technology can aid you in personalized care. But I think it's what you put into it and what kind of So I'm coming from looking at a lot of physical qualities associated with movements, and I think the combination of movements and how you quantify that is going to be important. And also how you look at continuous data, cyclical, and you look at how they express certain values as a function of time. This is important. Now I'm getting too detailed. I feel that. And I think tracking that and basing, can you rephrase the last part of that question? I'm sorry, I lost my track.
Well, I think what we're trying to understand, let me give you an example that maybe we can run through here. Okay? Let's use force plates because many of us are around force plates. It's something that, we all have some experience. You got an athlete who's got a 20% deficit, side to side. They didn't have that before, it was 10% 2 weeks ago. What do you do about that? How do you personalize that piece of information? It's just something, saw them jump, there was no difference that you could note from the way they jumped, but the number is there now. What do you do?
What you do, I would first and foremost look at, was it a personal error on my end? Then I would look at what was the variation of that performance leading up to that. Did it have like dips in that? What were some other factors associated with that we can identify, like when was it done? Is it the different equipment? So there are all these things about the validity and the reliability of the data that we get in before we turn everything into play and saying like, whoa, this is bad, we have to do something immediately.
But that's really in real time. Now let's take the real time example.
Yeah.
Let's go to Andy. In that scenario, your patient's like, all right, yeah, I saw that number. Does that mean anything? It's a simple question, but it's got a lot of meaning on the back end, depending upon how you say it. What do you say to that person in that moment? How do you approach that conversation?
I think you've got to just get the context, and that's the biggest factor with all this. I think if you're talking about monitoring, then and some of the teams that I've worked with use force plate analysis for monitoring. And you're looking at fluctuations. What it does, it helps guide decision making. It doesn't make the decision for you. It's the same as GPS data or all the different types of data. You have to have the context around it. You need to know if you're doing a rehab, for instance, as opposed to just monitoring healthy athletes. What phase of the rehab are they in? And what do they need to accomplish in that phase? Now, the technology and the data can help guide the criteria so you can make criteria more objective. But ultimately, you have to have the reference of the sport as the starting point and understand where they need to get to. So there could be context around, for example, imagine there's 3 different scenarios which you'll face in any rehab, for instance. Three different scenarios, and we're looking at just GPS data in isolation. Now the GPS data, the physiological data, the outputs are all exactly the same. But they're all around 3 different scenarios through the rehab. Now you've got the rehab itself, you've got training, and then you've got competition. Now if you're comparing rehab data to competition data, there's a huge gap in the assumption there, because there's no context. And the game itself, you're not measuring just the physiological outputs when they're playing. There's all the cognitive side of the game too, the psychological outputs. So you have to understand what does that data mean in reference to the situation and what's the context. Otherwise, there's always gaps in and assumptions in the return to play plan, and also in your monitoring.
Yeah, and so to take that one step further, and we'll go to you, Alex. Look, we talk about force plates or GPS, and the selling point to buy these products for teams is usually it's going to prevent injury. And now you have somebody, and it says, again, person had a high volume, there is a higher likelihood of getting hurt, but they don't get hurt. And now they come in and like, see, that thing was wrong. I'm not doing it again. Alex, how do you approach that in the patient where you do Dari motion or you use a tool that flags somebody, but they don't get hurt? We have a saying at home that you can do the right thing and have the wrong result. You can do the wrong thing and have the right result. It's one time. How do you approach that at the clinical level with an individual patient? And then Joel, how do you approach that at the athlete level?
So I think overall, and it brings up a very good point about looking at context of when it was taken. The one thing, to go back to your other question, that you cannot do, in my opinion, is to discredit your own data. Because then if you're trying to get the athlete to buy in, the team to buy in, or the group of athletes to buy in, to the fact that your algorithm of data points is important, then part of what you're telling them is that it's a process of what we gather. A functional test, an isolated test, maybe 2 or 3 isolated tests that all feed into that. So if you do get something that raises your eyebrows and theirs, my first thought is, okay, this is a data point, just like the many others we've had before. Let's dig into what this functional test means. Does it actually mean you're not producing force on one side versus the other? Or you're not able to dissipate force? So you have to be confident enough in the clinical questions you've had before and the reason you got the software and the hardware you did so that you can rely back on what you actually know. Because none of us, from a clinical standpoint, and maybe I think from a tech standpoint, are 100% sure that the questions we're answering with the data and the technology are answering the questions we had previously on how to not get somebody hurt or how to improve performance.
It might just give you better questions. It might not give you an answer.
Correct. And so if all of a sudden it asks a question you weren't actually trying to answer or weren't hoping nobody would ask, you have to figure out, did I get this piece of technology as part of my thought process prior to getting it that is actually something I believe in as a clinician? And so, in that moment, in my opinion, what you do is you fall back on what you're confident in, which is how do we get to, or why do we test this person, right? I think it's maybe as a selling point to the administrative staff, it's injury prevention or it's performance enhancement. But I think from an athlete perspective, or clinician perspective, we're trying to get tools to answer questions that we clinically have had that allow us to answer these questions faster and more effectively. And if we're giving you technology, if we're getting technology that answers questions that we're not even sure we had or why we should be having, because, Joel will touch on this, I think, a lot. We don't know enough about women's sports to ask the questions we should be asking. So the technology will help us answer and ask those questions. But if we don't know why we should be asking them, then we're just we're making it up on every test.
There's a lot of white space in women's sports, and I know you guys are going to touch on this with your panel later on today. But the reality is women's sports don't get the same access to care and technology that men's sports do. Understanding that, and that we need to change that, how do you use that in an optimal way to understand the female athlete?
Yeah, so this scenario is very realistic in the women's side because you have people being with teams who some teams have no resources and teams have all the resources. So let's say you have an athlete who maybe didn't have routine tests and measures and all these have this knowledge of all these metrics on themselves, come to a team that is now doing all that, and they'll tell you, well, if that's always been the case, how come I was able to play like that last year? And even some athletes who do have the knowledge of a little more than others, it may not resonate with their personality. I remember one player, Carly Lloyd, she, you could do all the tests with her, and one time she said, well, you know what that test doesn't measure? And she just pointed to her heart, meaning like heart drive. And I was like, you're absolutely right. Whatever number I tell you, you can easily go score a hat trick and win a World Cup. So don't listen to me, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
But, it's a very realistic example on the women's side. So something that is getting driven to change. So that way we have more data on our athletes. But I think your question was, how do I then approach that situation?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, just kind of like with that example with Carly, you have very real conversations. Hopefully you've developed and worked on that relationship with this athlete that you're working with. And like all of them have said, it's very contextual. You could, but I would advise it, taking one metric and then making that sole decision off that metric. Also, I'm not the sole decision maker. I can help guide the conversation, but from the groups that I work with, it's typically a performance team that is then discussing these red flags that we're finding to then look at all the context of maybe something that I'm not seeing, maybe they see. So you gather all the information, you present it to the athlete, you have these conversations, and maybe they'll take you up on it, maybe they won't, but that is very much kind of the culture shift in women's sports in general, I would say right now.
Awesome. On the tech side, Garrett, you have technology that makes people feel good, right? And it helps athletes get through an event or recover better. At the same time, is it masking some of the symptoms? Is it masking some of the things to help someone get through? And what I think each of these guys are going to answer in a subsequent question here is, best athletes compensate. Best athletes just figure out a way. How does your technology help the athletes find a way?
That's a great point. The best athletes are the best compensators up to a point, because eventually that window that they have to compensate starts to close. They take one path and then a little less becomes available. Next time, a little less becomes available. So eventually that narrows and catches up with them. So if we had this example where you mentioned there's a 20% asymmetry on a force plate, assuming we can trust the data and all those are very valid concerns, and assuming the context is appropriate, if we were to have that information, what we would do is we'd look for, okay, why is there 20% less output on one leg than the other? And ultimately, one of the trends that we're seeing that I hope we're contributing to helping to lead is a trend towards really looking at the nervous system and understanding the importance of the nervous system, because it is, of course, the control system of the body. So trying to figure out why there's some sort of inhibition on that side. It could go back to some biomechanical flaw or something like that, but we'd actually want to map the body and find where the nervous system is guarding or inhibiting, or where there's hypersensitivities that could lead to pain and could be contributing to diminished performance there. So we want to find that, and then as we go through that process, we would actually rapidly retrain those areas, essentially turn the muscles back on. Oversimplified, but use that language for now. So then we retest and see if we've made up the gap on that deficit. Maybe we've gone from 20% to a 10% or 5% deficit. Okay, that's great. We're doing the right thing. Let's keep doing that. In terms of, are we just masking pain or things like that? There's a really interesting thing that we see where, and I think it's important when we're talking about rehab to understand that the symptoms or the limitations that athletes experience, part of them are based on structural or hardware damage, injury, and then some of them are based on software and the neurological response to that injury. And one of the things that we see when we go through this process is we can actually tell, based on how an athlete responds, how much is in one category versus in the other. We've had, for example, we're in Austin, so at UT, we've got, we're actually first time demonstrating there. So we had a guy who had a grade, they call it a 2.5 AC separation. He could only, after 4 days of treatment, could still only lift his arm up to about here. And we went around, we found where he was guarding, we found issues in supraspinatus and teres. And at the end of a few minutes, he was up here. A few more minutes, he was all the way up here. So in that case, obviously ligaments didn't heal in 8 minutes, right? But there, it was more of what he was experiencing, more of the pain, more of the limitation in range of motion. More of that was from that neurological response to the injury. And he was then able to work out with the team that afternoon, practice the next day, playing the game that Saturday. So then there's to answer the question, then there's the counter example of that. There's the times where we go through and work on these neurological compensation patterns, these responses to injury and trauma, and then the progress isn't quite as great. It barely happens at all, or it happens but then regresses to baseline within a few hours or something like that. And those are the cases where we can tell there's probably something more structural going on here. The expectations are likely going to change. Maybe refer out for imaging if we haven't done it already. I mean, usually at that point you have a sense of what's going on, but there's a way to kind of tell there. And using all this information, using this testing as a way to see if you're just masking something or if you're actually making real adaptations.
I suppose I've got two, going back to your original question. The force plate's a very blunt instrument, and the level of discrimination, obviously extending on the nervous system side, what we're doing with PRISM now is actually looking at the input component of the nervous system, so we can actually really individualise what's going on in those changes. So if that was somebody presenting with, coming through from the biomech department with significant issues from a force plate perspective, then we can actually drill down much more accurately in that sensory side. The other, just going back to the comment that you had in relation to how do you explain to somebody that you didn't get injured and we saw some measure that was there. I think a very important part of that is the communication process right from the very beginning with those athletes, with the rest of the team staff that are relevant to ensure that they, how do you explain probability to somebody who's got no idea about in that sense? it really is a communication process. That this is broadly looking at how to change things. It's not going to change things in terms of that injury on that day in 3 weeks' time. But very much, I think the fidelity, setting expectations, managing expectations, having really good, clear communications. But I think, as I said, what we can do now in the sensory space is really opening up a whole new green field in terms of digging into performance.
I appreciate that, and I think it touches on a really interesting topic about misinformation or disinformation in this era that we live in, where we are bombarded with stats and outcomes that tell us, hey, this is the right technology, or hey, I'm going to come back in 2 weeks, I'm going to come back in 5 months or 4 months after a certain surgery because I went to a certain surgeon. How do we combat misinformation and disinformation in this era where everything is a Google click away? Everything is a Google search away to find the information you're looking for, and we have to have truth and integrity in data. So I want to go to the three clinicians here, and really have you guys talk about, from your end, how do you guys approach that part? So let's start with Andy.
I think again it's around really outlining what the context is around the data and the information that they've been given, and then once you can understand what that information is in relation to, then you have a reference that you follow that helps guide your decision making. Which for me, it's always about, well, what's the sport, the demands of the game? How do we analyze that and break it down from a hierarchical perspective?
But they're coming to you with anecdotal evidence, right? Like they're like, my friend did it, my buddy did it. This is the world we live in. Like everybody's got a buddy or they've got a trainer who's coming to you, and they're now coming into the training room and saying, this is what I saw on Instagram. How do you address that in that moment and say, look, let's take a step back and let's really assess, like, what's the difference between you and that athlete?
Again, I think it's just about where it fits with what they're trying to do. What's your objective at the end of the day? I mean, it's such a vague question in terms of, like, what is the data that they're coming back with and what are they trying to achieve? I think relationships is key. And if you have a good relationship with the athlete, then you can buy trust. And then if you have a good understanding of the game and what they need to do, then you can buy further trust and see, well, what is your objective and how does that relate to what we're trying to achieve? And apply the layers of context around that. And I think just by communicating effectively, using language that they understand, and communicating how that thing that they've seen on Instagram, where that fits,
Yep.
and is that what's necessary to get them to where they need to be? But if you can't communicate that to them, then they get that misinformation, they go with it. So it's about gaining trust, being objective, and having a communications process and a language that you can use that they understand. But I think often when we become under threat, or when we get a little bit flustered with questions, you start going too technical. And you start using language and terminology that the athlete doesn't understand. We go very specific. And as practitioners, we often start from the technology or the data or the bottom-up, our own industry, and use that language to communicate to the athlete. Whereas they've not trained like you, they want from a different country, from a different sport, different culture. You have to keep some common ground and communicate to them in a way that they will buy in and understand. So you start with the game language, and then you start to influence from that perspective, and then you buy trust.
The language is everything, right? Like you're a translator. You're a translator of information into a language that, I always thought that I was going to be able to relate to a 20-year-old. Now I've got a 5-year-old. I'm pretty sure that I'm completely unrelatable to her in any way. As an aside, I took the master class from Chris Voss on negotiation. The terrorist negotiation class is really good for 5-year-olds. This may be an indictment on some of my parenting too. But it's something to think about. How do you get someone to give you their tell? How do you get someone to give you their incentives? Charlie Munger talks about, if you want to understand behavior, understand the incentives. Alex, Joel, you guys approach it from the language and the translation of increasingly young people. People keep getting younger. We keep getting older.
So first off, I like never split the difference, and finding that black swan from Chris Voss. I think genuinely you have to, similar to that test that raises both yours and their eyebrows. the last thing that I would always suggest to do is dismay their information. They're clearly coming to you with that information because it contradicts something that they either perceived you said or actually that you said. And so what you need to be able to do, because often that information doesn't come out of thin air. Disinformation, to me, is completely actually from a baseless area that someone just made up. Anecdotal information came from some kind of factual evidence that occurred. It may not be at all applicable to their situation, but they don't know that. And if you tell them flat out, well, that doesn't apply, you lost them. And so the last thing I want to do is somehow disqualify them as being a source of information. And so initially, what you want to do, I'm always trying to figure out, do I have enough time and do I want to put in enough effort to disprove this? Or do I need to basically figure out how to, as you said, negotiate with them so they get to the part where they understand, okay, you know what, you're right, that's not as valuable of information without me telling them that. So I think disinformation in general is something that's dangerous, but to me, I always tell them, I'm happy to stay on my toes as long as it's something you're willing to talk about. So the initial thing is disarm them that it's not a conflict. We are on the same page. If you've got something I don't know about yet, I'll go look into it.
Yeah, I think curiosity, showing that innate curiosity from ourselves is a really humble way to just be like, hey, just like the boss would say, hey, tell me a little bit about that. Just show a little bit of curiosity. They start giving you their tell and what they're incentivized by, and then it becomes easy. Joel?
Yeah. Sorry. I completely agree with what they said, and like you were just talking about, showing that curiosity, not just doing away with the information they present to you, because like Alex said, if you do that, you will lose them, and that's not a good spot to be in, especially if you work with a team. So, however you can demonstrate to them that, yeah, you're willing to almost put your ego aside and look into what they're talking about. Once you do that, then, like Andy had said, you come with your objectives, you come with your evidence-backed information, and then also whatever evidence-informed decisions that you would, or plan that you would develop, and then talk it out with them, because again, dependent on the team or whatever organizational structure you have, I'm not always the sole decision maker. It is a conversation with them. It is a negotiation with them. So how do I combat that? It's tough, but ultimately just try to do my best to rely on, like we already said, developing that relationship, developing that trust, and then having that communication styles with them. So then when those challenging situations come, you've already set those foundations in working with people, and just try to rely on that. But in the end, if they end up choosing the advice that's not your advice, you either have to be okay with that or you don't. And then if you're not, again, whatever that looks like, there's might be some changes, who knows? But ultimately, put your ego aside and just try to do what's best for the athlete.
I appreciate that, the thoughtfulness from all three of you. We got a couple minutes left here, and I want to ask about another topic that we kind of chatted about beforehand, which is AI. And I want to start with Ola, and I want you guys to be brief. What's going to change over the next, we'll say, 24 months in sports performance, sports health, because of AI over the next 2 years?
That could be with good data input. It can help the output, being the training program, the training plan. It could be a guide and assess while training to then accommodate to the 20% discrepancy that was observed. Okay, are there things here, that information here that we can then use and automate within that training session? Analyze data over time, so the entire training program.
You think we'll get to all this in the next 2 years?
Well, maybe that's a little longer vision. But one thing that I really think that people are exploring right now with different tools is the continuous data and how continuous data behave over cyclical movements, and being able to identify small subtle things in continuous data that might be important.
Let's go to Garrett and Gordon here, and then we'll see if we have time for the practitioners too.
I think with all this data, making some progress towards, I know we've already talked about how difficult it is to necessarily predict injury, but to much more precisely quantify the risk of injury. If it's a stochastic process and there's or probabilistic process and there's a certain percentage, I think get better at that. And then also loop in a lot more data to that, like the Sapiens guys out there with CGM, and be able to have more data sources that feed into that too. So strength and movement measurement, and then some of these other elements that are part of how we handle stress, part of how we recover or don't recover, part of how we adapt or don't to the various stresses and challenges. So I think getting more data and then using that predictively.
I think probably an interesting thing here is going to be the interface between what the athlete can actually take in information-wise versus what can be actually provided. And I think that's going to become more and more important in terms of the relationship between the organisation, the company that's providing that information, and how they're synthesising that. I think those opportunities could be realised there. Because, I mean, we've already just been saying that there's all sorts of issues in relation to misinformation, volume of information, and obviously that interface is going to be a critical point of pressure in that process.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in, to go to the clinicians here, I don't think any of us have to worry that a chatbot is going to replace us. Elon may think that over time we're all going to be replaced and every job will be replaced, but the reality is best AI is probably going to be a digital extension of practitioners. Thinking about that, how can a practitioner best use AI to help care for an athlete in the current version over the next 12 months? How can you best use it? Let's start with Joel and work our way down.
Can we actually not start with me?
We could go to Andy.
I think, it depends on the type of model that you want to build and the topic that you want to use it for. But for me, it's about aggregating as much information as quickly as possible and then being able to make better decisions around the topic area that you're interested in. So it's the speed at which you can action things, which has your influence, and you still need to be able to, determine the decision and the outcome. But having quicker access to information in a certain topic area that can guide your decision making quicker, and that's essential in sport. So aggregating information, acting quickly on it.
Alex?
So I think that it would help in the very short term to answer questions of things we haven't looked deeply into, whether that be in women's sports, whether it be in mental health, whether it be in psychological or external stressors. I think quite a bit of money and time has been spent on physical assessment, and so I think from that standpoint, to tie those two things in together, or those 50 things in together, will be great, but that's further down the line. Right now, as someone sort of pointed out, how much that athlete is able to digest that day is dependent on a lot more than what their physical state is. And if AI or some sort of aggregation of other data, whether it's their HRV or anything else, can help me figure out how much I'm going to push into them so that they can give me output, I think that to me is the most helpful thing right now.
Yeah, so I let the smart guys talk first. And I go with the coattails. Anyways, totally agree with the aggregation of information. And for me, I've worked with some of the best teams in the world and some of the teams that have absolutely nothing in the world. And so I'm always thinking about, well, how can we make this information, this data, even accessible to and applicable to people who don't have anything? So I think AI can probably help, like they already said, aggregate the information to help us as practitioners on the highest level get to decision making probably quicker, and then maybe, hopefully, people who are helping underserved teams have any sort of access to information, but at the same speed. So same thing, but just different application points.
Yeah, I think we touched on this before we came out here, that what we do in pro sport hopefully can be reflected back to youth sports, hopefully can be reflected back to the population. And I think that that's really important for everything that we do. How do we take what we do, give great care to the best athletes in the world and help them compete? But we should always be thinking about how we can give that back to the broader community in a usable way. That's really what I think, that's how tech companies get built. But that's something that we as practitioners should always be thinking, because that should be our goal. We're very fortunate to work in pro sports, but it's even better if we can help everybody else. So thank you guys. I know they're going to cut us off here, but really appreciate everybody joining, and thank you to the panelists. You guys are great.